SNP spokesperson. Patricia.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I'm delighted to participate in this debate this afternoon on support for bereaved children, and I thank the Honourable Lady for Edinburgh West for bringing it forward. She and I don't agree on many things, but I absolutely agreed with the excellent speech that she opened the debate with. And like many people who have spoken today, I want to focus my remarks largely on children who are bereaved by the loss of a parent. And like many other in the debate, I also declare an interest, Mr Deputy Speaker, as I come from this debate having been bereaved twice as a child. As the youngest of 8 children, my father died when I was 15 months old in 1969, and my stepfather died when I was 17 years old. Both of these events had a huge impact on my family. When my father died, the eldest child in the family, my eldest sibling, was 14 years old. And I think I'm perhaps the only member of the family who has no memory of my father. I've never even seen a photograph of him. Given the poverty in which I was raised, photographs were a luxury far beyond the family's reach. My father was a labourer and died very suddenly of a heart attack whilst waiting for a minibus to pick him up for his shift at Hamilton Cross, far from home. I have no memory of that, but the shock waves through my family were significant. And as an immigrant, my mother had no idea about what support, financial or otherwise, could or would have been made available to her. So she struggled on with no more support than her own resilience and family allowance. And I well remember my stepfather, who died at home suddenly in 1985, also of a heart attack. I was there when it happened, and it was truly traumatic. And my mother never really recovered from the shock and died a short 5 years later. And on both occasions, my family's reaction took the lead from my mother, who at the best of times could never be described as a tactile woman, but the way to deal with it was to simply plough on, get on with things. Loss wasn't discussed, and certainly when my father died in 1969, my mother, left alone with 8 children, her way of dealing with it was just to make sure that everybody was shod, fed as best they could be, and looked after with the basics. And I have to say that approach to loss as a child and growing up with that, I hate to use the phrase, but that stiff upper lip, you just go on with things, it's very much shaped how I have dealt with subsequent bereavements in my own life. And I remember as a child, when I was at school in 1974, 2 children in my school, brother and sister, were murdered. And one of the children in the family obviously hadn't been murdered, and I remember the reaction at the time. It attracted huge publicity. You saw it in the papers, children were frightened. And I remember as a school we went down to the funeral service and we sang the hymns for the funeral service. And I remember as a child, I was 8 years old at the time, and I remember being very traumatised by the sight of these 2 little white coffins. I can't even begin to imagine how the surviving child felt. And I remember when the service finished, we were marched back to school, and immediately the workbooks were given out and you were back to your work and nothing was said. And of course nowadays that wouldn't happen. But these things, these way that loss and bereavement is dealt with for children, it actually shapes how they then go on as an adult to process grief. And I think that's why I have dealt with grief subsequently the way that I have. I'm not aware that it's done me any harm, but I know that for a lot of children that could be very, very destructive. So I think looking at, debating, discussing how children should be supported in managing grief, I think it really matters, and I think that's why this debate is so important. I've spoken a great deal about bereavement in this House, and I brought forward the Bereavement Leave and Pay Bill, which asked very modestly for 2 weeks paid bereavement leave for anyone who loses a close family member, because the cost of this is offset by the benefits to society, and I think that there's lots of evidence that that is the case. And that bill mattered and it still matters even though it didn't pass. It matters because we need to look after those who are bereaved, and we need to support bereaved parents who have to look after their grieving children as well as try to cope with their own grief. We know that how children cope or don't cope with grief can have a longer-term impact on their own mental health, wider outcomes and general well-being, and how government is able to support those grieving, especially bereaved children, alongside surviving parents, really matters. To get it wrong, and I don't know that we're getting it right, getting it wrong does have a huge social cost, which outweighs any economic cost. Put simply, we can't afford to fail bereaved children. As we've heard from the Honourable Member for Strangford, the Child Bereavement Network estimates that 26,900 parents die each year in the UK, leaving approximately 46,300 dependent children aged up to 17 years old. By age 10, 62% of Scottish children will have lost a close family member, and by age 16, up to 7% of children in the UK will have lost a parent. And remember, when children lose a parent, there's another parent who has to somehow navigate their own grief and the grief of their child. But I remember a few years back, I think it might have been 2017, I remember we had a debate when the government brought in changes to payments for bereaved parents, and I very much criticised that move at the time. It's done now, the argument's over because the legislation's gone through, the changes have been made. But the reason why I was concerned about that legislation, or that change to legislation, is that those who are grieving need support, and unless that support is adequate, the social fallout is significant, and we all pay the price for that. At the time, I expressed real concern about the consequences of the so-called streamlining of these payments for children, the potential detrimental consequences for their emotional and mental well-being, as well as their educational outcomes. Because we all know, we all understand that the bereaved need time, and that time that they need to process and somehow come to terms with their grief, we know it varies from person to person. And how long a person needs to emerge from the fog of bewilderment, shock and disbelief, as well as the pain of the grief that the loss of a loved one brings with it, we know what that's like, but how much worse is that for children? And cash payments for bereaved parents are now limited to 18 months, and I feel that that means that grief has been given a sell-by date, but it isn't like that. If only it were like that. And we know that when parents have been bereaved and they're left to bring up their children on their own, we know that the surviving parent wants to be around to support, listen and help their children to make some sense of the irreplaceable loss that they have suffered. That's where bereaved parents want to be and where they ought to be, not stuck in an office or on a shop floor having to put in extra hours to make up their income shortfall due to the death of their partner and hoping that friends and neighbours will step in. And my fear is that the recent streamlining cuts to the bereavement payment regime disproportionately affects women. Working age women are more likely to claim bereavement allowance, with recent figures showing that most people who claim this are women. Nobody wants to claim bereavement support. Nobody expects to claim bereavement support. But its existence is vital for bereaved parents who are left to bring up children with one parent missing, with all the grief and distress that that can bring. And some people in the debate today have mentioned this, but having been an English teacher for 23 years before I was elected, I can personally testify to the terrific and extremely sensitive support young people can receive in schools following the loss of a parent or close family member. That kind of support is essential, of course, in helping children process and come to terms with their loss, but that kind of support isn't always available, and it's not always of the same standard. And I think I've alluded to the fact that when I was at school in the 70s or 80s, if somebody in the school lost one of their parents or close family member, it was never mentioned, it was never discussed, and that's not particularly healthy for every child. And we know in the early days of grief, a child will be in the fog of disbelief, bewilderment, and the surviving parent is not always able to help them navigate and process that grief because they are suffering their own grief and trying to navigate their own bewilderment and loss. And that's where outside agencies such as schools, but not just schools, but such as schools, can provide vital support to bereaved children, and also why an appropriate level of financial support is necessary, crucial, so that the family unit can work through their grief with less financial pressure interfering with that process. Everybody in this debate understands that we need to continue to do more to support children who are struggling with bereavement, as well as their bereaved parents who lose a spouse, who will struggle also, but have to continue to be the responsible parent and meet their child's needs, and they'll need support with that. Having this debate, I think, is extremely helpful, as too often grief and its corrosive impact is not discussed as openly as it should be. We need to get better at just talking about dying, because death touches every family and we all experience it. We need to do better at supporting children through the death of close family members and helping them make sense of that in a way that is suitable for that child. If we can do that, we will have healthier, happier and well-balanced children who in turn will be better at supporting their own children through such loss. That's where we need to get to as a society. We're not there yet, but we need to get better at supporting bereaved parents as well, because the death of the bereavement that a child suffers is inherently linked to their other parent if it's a parent that has been lost. Ultimately, this is about ensuring that despite the confusion, trauma and bewildering impact grief can cause children who lose a close family member, children affected can and will, with support, recover and go on to live healthier, happier and more fulfilled lives. And I think it's really important that we have this debate and we keep on pursuing this subject, because there's a lot of work to do here.